guys, let's talk about variables. Before we get started on this topic, we're going to create a new class so that I could keep this in one class, one of these files, and every new topic will keep it in a new file. And the best part is we'll keep it all in the same project so we don't have to keep opening and closing to come back to, let's say, our lecture notes or anything similar. So over here, I'm going to right click. So on my package, on my package basics, I'm going to right click new Java class. And we're going to call this one, let's say, I don't know, let's call it variables. And as always, make sure that the name of the class is capitalized. And again, the placeholder here, the watermark, you could always notice that it's a capital letter, and you gotta respect these rules. And we're gonna come back on that a bit later. So let's call this one variables, and press enter. And I did say to you guys, you don't need to. You should only have one entry point to your application. Otherwise, the program is going to be confused. But because here we're in development mode, we could have one entry, one main method, and we could have another main method right here as well. I'm going to type in main, press enter for it to automatically fill this for us. And now you can see that I have two files, and this is going to make it easier for us to navigate or to create different notes and not lose our stuff. Later on, maybe you could create yourself a package for assignments, labs, etc., and put all your files in there as need be. Just mind you, this could become a bit problemsome when stuff gets repeated. We'll see that as we get in the future. For now, let's talk about variables. So, how should we go at this? The first thing is, why do we need variables and what are they? Well, variables actually, sorry, I'm just gonna get my pen out 1 second. So, let's talk about variables. So, I got my pen. So, what is variables? Well, eventually we'll need to store some information. Actually, let me state it in a different way. We've talked so far that main is our entry point, and that our program, our application, will run one state at a time from top to bottom, one statement at a time. Now, what would happen if I needed to understand what happened in the previous statement? If I needed to keep some information to be able to utilize it in more than one statement? Well, the computer is not smart enough to know what you've done previously. It could just do the current task and that's it. It doesn't remember what it did previously. It doesn't know what's going to do in the future. It's really stupid. It could only do one statement at a time. So for us to be able to retrieve some information, to be able to understand what happened previously, we're going to use these things we call variables. Let me change color. Sorry, I just noticed it's red. It's hard to see. I'm going to be using something called variables. And what's interesting about variables, it's basically a placeholder. It holds the place for any values you want to put in there. What do I mean by that? Let's give you a good example. Let's say we're packing the house and we're about to move from this apartment to that apartment, or from this house to somewhere else. We have a lot of things to pack. So we put them inside these things we call boxes, right? And what's interesting about these boxes is, well, it contains our valuables. It contains whatever we want to store inside of them. And this is what variables do, right? So it's a box, allows us to store a value inside, and allows us to also put a name on the box so we don't make a mistake with all the other hundreds of boxes that could be in the room, right? So we could say this box is for my shoe or my something, right? As an example, let's say this one is for my name. This one is for age. this one is for something else. I don't know, my size, let's say. Okay, and it goes on. So we could store anything we want into these boxes. We could store, we could define a name for them so that we could remember what's inside those boxes, inside those variables. And one last thing we have to notice is that sometimes our boxes are a bit weird, right? So let's say we have a box for our TV, right? So this is our TV box. And what I mean by weird is, well, we have a TV box, we have a name, age, and whatever, but actually let's make it into a more household stuff. We have a TV box and we have a shoe box, right? This is our shoe. There is a possibility our shoe could go into the TV box, but there is no way that our TV could fit inside our shoe. Okay, so we have a restriction in variables, and that's the type. And we're going to talk about this in a second. So inside of variables, it's a placeholder to contain some value for us, and we could access it at any moment we need to by calling that specific variable, and we're going to do that soon. Each variable has a specific type, so it's kind of restricted onto what could contain in there, and we're going to talk why we have this restriction. So he also has a name. And as a good practice, we need to always initialize our variables right at the beginning so we don't make any mistake. I can't spell. Initialize. There we go. I think I misspelled it again. Initialize. There we go. So we got to initialize our variables so that no accidents will happen. This is more of a good practice. Some of you will not follow this and it will hurt me because I'm telling you this is great practice. It will help you for your interviews. Now, let's get started on what I mean by these things. So let's put these placeholders for a hold. Let me erase these for now. We're going to come back to them. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is that type thing. We were just talking about how some stuff cannot fit into something else. Why is it that I can't just fit them wherever I want? Well, actually, before even doing that, let's get into the syntax. It's going to give us an idea. And from there, we'll start explaining a bit more in depth. And we'll go one step at a time. So to be able to create this variable, we need the type. We need a variable name. We need to initialize it. So we're going to say equal initialize. There we go. Okay. And at the end, it's a statement, so we need a semicolon. Okay. So there's a couple things here I want to specify before we go and writing the code. So the type over here. So the first thing, the type. This will determine what possible operations I could do on this variable. And it will also determine what values can be stored. So the operations I could do on this value, operations such as can I add them to another number as an example, or can I convert them, can I, let's say, output them to the console, etc., etc. There's a lot of these things. So operations that I could perform on this variable. And the second thing is what values could be stored in this variable. And we're going to talk about all the different types, well, a few of them. So that's for variables. Now, for the variable name, this is going to help me distinguish one variable from another one. So this allows me to distinguish from one variable to the next. Think of it like this. If you're in the kitchen and you want to put, let's say, salt on your food, and you see 3 bottles and they all have white powder inside, how would you know which one's the salt? Well, the obvious answer would be like, well, I'm going to test it every time. So every time I want to put salt on something, I'm going to test them out. I might get sugar in my mouth. I might get flour in my mouth, whatever, for me to figure out which one's salt. Well, this is bad. You're making your life harder. So what you want to do is have a great variable name, something that will distinguish it from one to the other one, and make sure that it says what it is. Right? So you want to make sure that this is meaningful. I gotta learn how to spell meaningful. And that it's a readable name. So something not too complex, not abbreviated, not made into weird stuff. Okay? And one last rule for this is it cannot start with numbers. Cannot start with numbers. So you can't do 1, 2, 3 or etc. You can't start with a 3. You could end it with a 3, but you can't start it with a 3. Okay? Now, next part. Let's see. This equal sign is an assignment. So it assigns this value, this initialized value, to this variable. So this is where you get to put the placeholder's value to something. So it allows you to set this variable's name with whatever value you put inside initialize. Okay? Initialize basically means it's the first value that variable is going to have. It's going to be initialized into something. Why do I require you to initialize all variables? Is because the default value of most variables, the default value of these types, are different on different systems and different languages. So it's better practice to set a value that you recognize or you know that's going to be correct than to allow the system deciding things for you. Okay? Now, take a screenshot. As always, make your notes. One last thing I'm going to specify, but we're not going to utilize, and I'm going to regret telling you this. There's one last thing since Java 10, and that's called Java inference. Type inference. Basically, we omit saying the type. So normally we would say var rather than specifying what it is. And the compiler, the computer, will figure out what the type is. But this is not good for beginners. If you do this in my code class, you're going to lose a lot of marks. The problem with this, especially for beginners, is it affects your code readability. There's a lot of different types, and sometimes it will assign a type that it shouldn't, or it's not useful, or there's a lot of issues that comes out from this. Obviously, you're going to say, well, if you know some programming, you have some fight in you on why you should use it, blah, blah, blah. We could discuss it on our own time. But even though this is available to you, you're not allowed to use it in my class. Okay? There's a lot of good reasons for this, and I don't want to get to the topic right now, but note that it's there. Now. So, give you an example of how this would be written. So we're gonna take our mouse here. We're gonna start typing what the type is. In the next video, we'll talk about these types. So as an example, we're gonna say string. I'm gonna create a variable name here. Let's say name. And I'm gonna give it a value of initial value of Reza. Then I'm gonna go system.out. And I'm gonna say, rather than saying the value Reza, I'm gonna utilize the variable and get the value inside of it by saying name. I'm gonna press play. And you're gonna notice it's going to print out Reza. Right? So this is the initial part about variables. I'll see you in the next videos where we'll talk more about the different types of variables that we have and so forth.